Okay.
Welcome, everyone, to today's lecture. It is called Where to Begin Building a Strong Foundation for Your Novel or Memoir. We're welcoming in Rebecca Pickens, who is going to be lecturing. I believe I'm not yet sharing the screen, so let me just share my screen so that you can look on with me at her page. Here we go. So this is her lecture page. You can find it on SoMeDocs and specifically under the Explore button in the Lectures and Courses section. And there you will find all the courses and all the lectures that are coming up. And then there's also an on-demand space where you can find lectures just like this that are free to access and are not part of any course. So, with that in mind, I am going to open up her profile or SoMeDocs profile, which lies in our Experts for Doctors directory. And you can read all about her. And you can see some of the other lectures that she has delivered for our audience, namely for our first and second, I think it was the second annual writers conference
Mhm.
and maybe a few others. And a little bit about her. She's a writer, editor, and book coach who works with writers at every stage of their creative journey. She's also host of Self-Editing Essential, a group coaching program for writers who have finished or almost finished writing a memoir or novel and are ready to learn the art of self-editing. Her short fiction's been nominated for the Penn Robert J. Dow Short Story Prize for Emerging Writers and most recently the Pushcart Prize. Rebecca is currently at work on a novel, and you can check out all her things there in her different pages. And up here, you can see where she is on social media and her website. And of course, we always encourage you, if you have watched this lecture specifically, to send her an inquiry through her profile. This will land in her email, and just let her know how much you enjoyed her talk, or if you have any questions, you can send it her way too. Last but not least, we do have a WhatsApp room that's for writers, and we invite you to come in there as well. All right, without further ado, Rebecca, I'm going to clear the stage and good luck with the lecture.
Thank you so much, Dana. It is such a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. I have to just start by saying I love working with doctors because you are a very unique combination of wildly imaginative, but also so well organized. And that's not always the case. So you have some really special superpowers in your writerly toolkits, I notice. So it is a special pleasure to be here today. So, what I wanted to do, this is really part one of a lecture series that I've been invited to do, which I'm calling From Idea to Published. And so, what we're going to do in this five-part series is really start at the most logical place, the very beginning of the writing process, and work through some of the major kind of seasons of the writing process all the way to the end where we'll be talking about publishing and how all of that looks in the current marketplace. But today we are going to start at the very, very beginning. And this is, well, on the one hand, you can think about this as a beginning, a lecture for somebody beginning. It actually is also going to be very helpful for you if you are a writer who is maybe on your third or fourth draft and you feel stuck. You feel like, this third draft is not that different than my first draft. Why is that? This can really help you as well because we are going to be digging in today into some real fundamental questions about what makes a story really work and gel at the foundational level. So there's really something in here for everyone if you are a fiction or memoir writer. So by the end of the session, my hope for you is that you will have the tools to get started on a diagnostic map of your project. You really have an understanding of maybe you won't have the answers to all of these questions, but you will know what questions to ask in order to get these answers. So we'll look at what story you really are actually telling, why it matters, who in your story changes, what circumstances in your story change, the major turning points, and the next step forward. So I did just mention, that most writers get to a stage where if they stick in there, if they hang in there long enough, they start to feel a little stuck. And it can feel very ambiguous. Why on earth am I getting stuck? I've been working really hard. I've been working at this for a long time. You'd be surprised at how easy it is to, once you really start to dig into what makes a story's foundation work, you'll find that there are some really key common reasons that books stall. It's not really usually a very exotic answer. The most common symptoms, and I see them all the time, are that we're constantly rewriting the opening of our story. I'm curious if this resonates at all for you. I think most writers get in this situation, particularly those of us who are perfectionists, where we figure, well, if I can't even get the beginning of my book to work, how can I keep writing this forward? I need to get these first pages solidified. And what we'll see today as we start to dig into how to build good bones for a story, then until we really answer some of the fundamental questions that I opened with on that early slide, until we have that stuff nailed down, the beginning of our story is likely to change dramatically before we reach the end of the story. So there's nothing more heartbreaking. And, I'm in the trenches with you. I'm in the writing life, and I have done this myself, where hours and hours, maybe months and months are spent perfecting the beginning of a story that ultimately we're going to hit the delete button for. So we want to kind of if you've been doing this, we want to really think about ways to avoid this habit and really dig into the deeper, bigger questions right from the get-go. We can often feel like we're being pulled in multiple directions by the characters in our stories. They have minds of their own, very much so, and they can be pulling us in a lot of different ways, and it's hard to know which path to take with them sometimes. We can feel like we have lots and lots of material, but no real story to tell. And we can also, all of this leads to that feeling of just stalled momentum where we just get stuck halfway through. It's harder and harder to sit at our desks and really do the work that needs to be done. I suspect that when writers have, I know that when writers have the foundational elements in place, the problems, the symptoms that I've just described tend to disappear because you have a much more clear path forward and you can finally just roll up your sleeves and start writing the story. So let's look at what I mean here. So the first thing, as doctors, you are so fortunate because you have so much source material. Every time you show up at the hospital or your doctor's office, there are stories all around you, dramas at every turn. And so source material, even if you're writing a mystery, even if you're writing something really different than a medical story, you've got so many people that you interact with that you've got great source material. But source material is not a story. So let me give you some examples of source material. We have a career in medicine, a difficult residency, the pandemic, a patient who changed you, a malpractice suit. This is a great start. I can imagine 100 different things you could do with each of these ideas, but they are raw materials. 100 different writers could come along and tell these stories or report on these ideas in very dramatically different ways. So, what is the difference between a subject or a source material versus the actual story? So, we've got subject, source material, a career in medicine. Great topic for a memoir. I have doctors come to me sometimes saying, I want to write about being a doctor in a rural community. And I get excited because that's a great premise. I think that this is something that we can work with, but it's not their story yet. And so what we'll do is spend a lot of time digging into, okay, what is unique? Why are you the person to tell this story? And what is your specific story? What lens are you going to be looking at this through? So an example would be a physician discovers that she's become the very kind of doctor she once feared becoming. Right? So do you see how we go from this very broad view angle to this story to a storyline that is specific and that only you can tell. We could think about burnout, but the story there is a physician who spent 20 years caring for everyone else until she no longer recognizes herself and decides to do something about that. Could have the subject or a source material about addiction, but the story is a son spends decades trying to understand his father's disappearances. So your subject is very broad, but your story is specific. And sometimes when we feel really confused and we feel like our story is just going in a million different directions, the real issue there is you haven't fine-tuned what it is you want to write about. You're still at that subject or source level, which is far too broad to really be able to tackle. So the question to ask yourself, because really when it's time to sit down and figure out what you're going to write about, you're going to be asking yourself a series of really interesting questions. And one of those is, what are you actually trying to understand? The strongest books are usually an author's attempt to try to understand and ultimately answer a question. So that can look like, why did I stay so long? Why couldn't I save him? What does ambition cost? Readers are very rarely interested in what you come to the page knowing. What they're interested in seeing is what kind of questions your story is going to unearth and how are the unique ways that you are going to wrestle with them. Because your approach to those questions is going to likely be very different than the reader's approach. And so that's where the interest blossoms. But the main point is they really want to see you doing the hard work to try to look at a specific situation through your unique lens. So, a reflection point I often ask writers to do is think about 5 experiences that belong in your book, or 5, I say experiences if you're writing memoir, or 5 ideas, 5 plot points, perhaps, if you're writing fiction. And then ask yourself, which of these are events? In other words, things that you are telling your reader, you already know how you think about them, you've already drawn your conclusions, versus how many still contain unanswered questions. I want writers to feel a certain level of understanding of their story before they really dig in and start writing. And I obviously want them to feel like they have answered those questions by the time the book is finished. But I also think there is enormous value in coming to an early draft, still curious, with your mind still really wide open, not knowing exactly where your story is going to take you, because that will keep you curious, which will in turn make your story much more vibrant for the reader. So, your doctors, I'm very glad that you are experts in what you do. We value expertise tremendously from our caregiver, from our healthcare providers. But in the writing life, expertise can create blind spots. And that can be a tough pill to swallow, right? We like feeling competent. We like knowing what we know. But when we're writing a story, or when we think about expertise, experts tend to explain and teach instead of dramatize. They tend to summarize like a reporter would instead of scene build. Expertise can make us teach instead of explore, right? We just talked about curiosity and how fundamental that is to an early draft. And we can tend to resolve complexity in an attempt to kind of tie things up and provide a satisfying conclusion, instead of residing in that complexity and really kind of looking under every stone and figuring out what is under here. What do I find over here? Right? It can be difficult as experts to reside comfortably in uncertainty. And yet, again, readers are not coming for expertise, they are coming for discovery. So once we sort of become comfortable in that role, say, okay, I'm here to learn too, just as much as my reader. That's a perfect time to start digging into the ideas that may be in your head already or that you're trying to generate. And we want to think about the anatomy of a good idea. Because as creatives, you're going to have a million ideas. You're smart people. You probably have more ideas than than you know what to do with. And so the question, what you really want to be able to do is drill into those ideas and figure out which ones are aligned with your creative goals and objectives right now. You're going to be writing this story probably for months and months, possibly many, many years. That would not be unusual. And I find that writers who stay engaged with their work and really see it through to the finish line, their stories have key elements that are really clear from the very beginning. Their ideas spark curiosity, not only for their reader, but for themselves. Again, they don't know all the answers when they start. The idea is responsible for mounting tension. A good story, even a quiet story, has many elements of tension to it. So this idea needs to be propulsive enough that it can spark tension. A good idea usually leads to your characters making a difficult choice, which often leads them to lots of contradictions that can cause them all kinds of difficulties. Usually, good ideas raise questions that do not have easy answers. This is true whether you're writing a very deep, a piece of literary fiction or a mystery or a thriller or a memoir. Questions that are not easily answered give you a lot more material to work with. Um, a good idea has lots of emotional charge. It makes your reader feel something, and it has a lot of specificity, right? If we think back to the slide where we talked about source material versus a story idea, the difference is that level of specificity. In other words, you know exactly what this story is about. You know what why this idea matters, and you understand how you're going to land it. A book, and I think that this is, I do a lot of writing with folks who write memoir about their professions. And this isn't just doctors. This is just kind of many people who are sort of doing legacy work, talking about their careers. And this is where I see this the most often, like I think less than this doesn't come up in fiction quite as much, but in memoir, it is so important to remember that it's not just a collection of experiences that we're curating for the reader. A memoir, or no book for that matter, is and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. That's how 6-year-olds relay stories. A book is because this happened, and because of that, everything changed. It's that connective tissue that really matters. It's stacking these different pieces of your story together to really create a narrative arc and a place where change can happen. So, for example, a story about medical training, we don't just want a series of adventures that happened along the way. Rather, we're showing up to that person's memoir to learn about their transformation. How did the medical training change them for better, for worse? How did it change people around them? We're always about transformation. Who's changing? What's changing? And why does that matter? Another thing to be thinking about in the beginning of thinking about your story's trajectory is we can think about context and we can think about story. Context answers some really key questions. Where does your story take place? Who are the people in the story? And how does the world work? And this can be, anything from high fantasy, where you have very complex world building, all the way down to, a very straightforward piece of fiction, just understanding the world that your characters inhabit. Then at another level, it's the ideas that lie beneath all of the context. What is changing for your characters? Who is affected and why does it matter? And oftentimes, when we are at the beginning of our story, we tend to think about one of these things or the other more. And a successful book will have lots of context and lots of story answers. These are things that work in conjunction. And it really depends on your methodology. When I work with a client, I ask a lot of questions to really figure out how does this writer think? How does this writer work? Some people like to get all that context down right away and just really understand the world they are creating. Where for a lot of other writers, it's the opposite. They want to know the what and the who and the how, and they'll kind of get to describing the neighborhood later on. And that is fine. I think that writers put a lot of pressure on themselves to get everything down on the page all at once. And the reality is, our brains don't really love that. Our brains like to specialize oftentimes in one or the other. And so it's a matter of experimentation and figuring out what works best for you. It really is kind of a trial and error experience to figure that out. But all along, you want to make sure you're thinking about both of these things early on in your process if you can. And if you are a writer who's watching today, who's at the revision process, it is not too late to go back and ask yourself questions. Where is context appearing? Do I have enough context? Have I answered these questions that a story should ask? Oftentimes, we don't catch that these elements are missing until we're much further along in the process. Your story is going to ask a central narrative question. I want to ask you, have you ever read a book that you didn't even particularly like that much, but you told somebody, I'm going to keep reading because I really want to find out what's going to happen? That is because even if the author didn't succeed in all the different ways, they nailed their central narrative question, enough so that you felt inspired to keep reading, even though you weren't loving the experience. Every book that succeeds creates a question. You can see that's kind of a theme for today. We're asking a lot of questions. We're posing a lot of questions. So, for example, will she leave? Will she leave? Will he forgive? Can she rebuild? Will he discover the truth? Can she become someone different? And the reader is turning the pages because they want to know how you are going to finish this up. How are you going to resolve all that tension that your story has been building upon? As I've said, every story is about change, whether you're talking about memoir or fiction. Someone begins one way and they end up a different way. You've probably heard mention of character arcs. A character arc is just a fancy way of describing this process. You're very, very rarely, especially if you have a dynamic protagonist, very rarely will they end a story at the same place that they started. Now, there are some exceptions to this. If you are writing a cozy mystery and you have a detective in your story, and maybe you're writing a series, and this detective shows up in every single volume, that may be what we call a flat character. And that can sound negative. It can sound like a judgment, like, oh, your character is really flat. That's not what we mean. We're talking about a Sherlock Holmes character in that instance, or a Miss Maple, right? Where it's Miss Marple, where it's we're counting on that character to be constant and steady. So there's not a lot of change there. The change is happening in the solving of the mystery or whatever it is they're involved with. But in general, and absolutely positively in the case of memoir, your story is about change. It's about seeing your characters experience transformation. So this is a really helpful exercise that I would encourage you to try at the beginning of as you start to think about putting together your story, and also later on in revision, testing to make sure that you can answer this question about your character. Because if you're unable to, that is a red flag. That's an area to go back to and really sharpen so you can answer these questions. So the first question is, at the beginning, my protagonist, or if you're a memoirist, that would be you, is what? And by the end, they are what? And to answer this question, you've got lots of different ways to think about this. Does their identity change? Do relationships change? Do their fundamental beliefs, maybe their entire moral system, does it change because of what happens in the story? Do they gain new understanding, or do circumstances around them change as a consequence of their behavior? And then we answer, by the end, they are what? What have they turned into as a consequence of your story? And this is really helpful. Um, I sometimes, when I see a writer struggling, I'll sometimes start with this exercise. It really gets to the heart of a story. It cuts out all that noise, all the things that we're worried about when we're starting a new draft. And this really gives you a starting place and a finish line that can make the whole process feel a lot more manageable. A good story always requires resistance. In other words, your job as a writer is to throw as many obstacles, as many difficulties in front of your characters as you can possibly come up with. It can be very difficult. We do love our characters, right? We fall in love with them, we care about them, and sometimes it can be like enough already. But we do want to keep that reader engaged, and we do want to provide as much opportunity for our characters to transform in as dynamic of a way as we possibly can. And so with each obstacle you throw their way that they need to recognize and react to, you are giving them more and more opportunity to be more and more interesting and successful. Or if you're writing something darker, you're giving them a chance to fail more spectacularly. So we have two kinds of obstacles. And I think sometimes when we are certain of what our genre is, we get it in our heads, writers can get it in their heads that they need internal obstacles or external obstacles, and they'll tend to lean in heavy on one or the other. But in actuality, no matter what genre you're writing, you do want a healthy distribution of both internal obstacles and external obstacles. Now, where it becomes interesting is depending on your genre, there's no hard, fast rule, but there is a little bit more of a formula in terms of um, let's say for a mystery, there are going to be far more external obstacles than there would be for a piece of literary fiction, which is going to be much more character driven. And so we will have a lot more internal obstacles. But a story that feels satisfying to the reader and has a certain level of nuance and complexity, even if it is an entertaining beach read, it is going to have its fair share of both. So let's look at what I mean by internal versus external. It's pretty clear. Internal obstacles are the things that reside inside your character. They come to the page with elements of fear and shame and grief and blind spots. And they may have started out in your story with these internal obstacles already there, and your story may be all about them fighting their way past these obstacles, overcoming them, and transforming in really dramatic ways. But it is oftentimes the case, too, that they may not come to the page with all of these obstacles, but instead we watch those internal obstacles develop as a consequence of external obstacles in the way that we read about in your story. So examples of that could be institutions, family members, illness, time, the circumstances of time, right? Any number of things that you throw at your character can then trigger these internal obstacles that arise. So these obstacles are really in conversation with one another. So hopefully your takeaway, hopefully it's starting to become clear that despite our instinct, when we decide we're going to write a story to just sit down and write it, I want you to fight that instinct to start with chapter one. Instead, as you can see so far, we're talking about identifying your story's structure. So I highly recommend building the framework first. Now, I'm going to pause here for a minute because I'm guessing that 50% of the folks who are watching this will say, oh, finally, a framework. Okay, are we going to talk about outlining, Rebecca? I love outlining. And if that's your feeling, then you are a plotter. You like to do a lot of this heavy lifting structural work at the get-go, up front. And if you're saying, oh, I better watch a different video, she's about to talk about outlining, then you are my friend. You are a pantser. You are a person who likes to write their way toward discovery, to find out what your story is about. Um, Examples of this, I once worked with a client who she was writing this like epic retelling of a mythological story. It was amazing, so complicated. And one week she said, I think I want to give you my outline. I want you to tell me if this is going to work. I said, sure. And I said, I can take a look at it right now because I was envisioning the kind of outline I usually see. 20 pages maybe. I'll never forget it. The outline I got from this writer was 87 pages single space. I was floored. She'd practically written the book. It was so involved. But as a result, I watched her go about her business. I mean, she just had a wonderful time writing her story because she'd already done so much of the fundamental work that she could really just get in there and play and just plug in her ideas and all her fight scenes and her descriptions and her characters' quirks. So for plotters, that is very reassuring. For pantsers, it is a very discouraging experience to get too bogged down in outlining. I'm working with a client right now who's a very gifted fantasy writer. And she came to me and she said, oh, her whole reason for coming to me at first was she wanted me to help her like writing again. She knew she was a pantser, but there's kind of a lot of pressure in the writing community these days to be a plotter. There's a lot of, because it works so well for some people, but it's not for everyone. You've got to find your way and figure out your own style. She felt convinced that she needed to learn how to do some outlining. And like a good student, she did everything the instructor said to do. And she had this very beautiful outline. And she said, I don't care about my story anymore. I already know all the answers. I'm bored with it. How do I fall in love with my story? And so she started by just ripping up her outline and trying to forget everything she had learned from it. So my point here is that there are a million different ways to write a book, and there's no better that I wouldn't say that one of these methods is better than another. It's figuring out what works for you. However, regardless of that, I do think that even pantsers do well with a framework in place. And that framework can be as detailed or as vague as is comfortable to you. But if you can identify these four simple elements and develop them as much or as little as you like, you are going to have a foundation on which you can then go and use whatever process feels most comfortable for you. So the framework that I like to work with in its most basic form is thinking about a story's disruption, the journey, the crisis, and the transformation. You're really thinking more in terms of landmarks along the way in your story rather than the function of, specific chapters. So in A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens knows probably very early on exactly the transformation that he wanted Scrooge to go through. So he starts with the disruption, the moment that life becomes unstable, the thing that cannot be ignored. So you'll often hear this referred to as the inciting incident. It's the event, it's the whole event that kicks everything off and makes this story necessary. So let's take our example of the Christmas Carol, and we're going to use that to go through each of these different elements. Ebenezer Scrooge is living his normal, very miserly life when we meet him, and Dickens kind of sets that up so we have a sense of what that looks like. But very early on, once it's established who Ebenezer is in the early pages, Marley suddenly appears, or the ghost of Marley appears. And now, what's so brilliant about this moment is it is radically different than anything Scrooge believes could actually be true. The world is no longer operating the way he understands it. All the rules are being broken. And as a result, everything has to change. This disruption cannot be ignored. So now I want you to think about your own story. Again, if you are just starting to think about your story, this is going to take some time. This is a great question to ask yourself. You can journal about it, you can workshop it. If you are in the revision stage, please also ask yourself this question about your story. What event, discovery, loss, a diagnosis or a decision or an encounter destabilizes your protagonist's life. Okay, so there needs to be a single incident that your reader can instantly understand and really be aware of that destabilizes your protagonist. So now anything could happen because they are no longer on steady ground. Once they're disrupted, your protagonist has no choice. They cannot remain passive. I mean, they can remain passive. That can even be a story point, but that's still going to move the story forward because remaining passive has consequences too. So, in the case of A Christmas Carol, three spirits force Scrooge to confront. He obviously cannot ignore their presence, so he must deal with his past, his present, and his future. And what Dickens does so brilliantly, and we're also familiar with this story now that it's just kind of, we could all just recite it off the top of our heads, probably. There have been so many adaptations. But if you go back and you look at the original text, you'll really be in awe of the craftsmanship. I'm a huge Dickens fan, so I am biased, but his craftsmanship is just astounding because he doesn't just show us three different ghosts and tell us a series of different facts. Each of these encounters is deepening Ebenezer's understanding of what kind of trouble he's in and what kind of life he has lived on a deeper and deeper and deeper level. And so his anguish is believable. It's earned because Dickens has taken us so carefully by the hand and immersed us so fully in the journey that we can well imagine how Scrooge is feeling as he looks back on his life and really reflects on how he's behaved and what it might look like in the future. So asking yourself here, what experiences in your story forced your protagonist to see the world differently? Next, we have the crisis, that moment when the protagonist can no longer avoid the truth. They've been on the journey. They have formed an understanding. They have a new, deeper understanding of whatever it is that happened around them. In our Christmas Carol example, Scrooge sees his own lonely death. He realizes this is what's going to happen to him if he doesn't change his ways. There are no mourners at his funeral. Tiny Tim doesn't fare well. And so for a moment, those consequences are crystal clear. And so you're going to ask yourself, what is the moment when the cost of not changing becomes undeniable? So our characters in most books will make the same mistakes, or they'll make different mistakes, but they will continue to make mistakes, or they will continue to battle demons or jump over obstacles for much of our story. But then at a certain point, they can no longer keep going the way they have been. They've hit that crisis point, and just like Scrooge, they need to recognize it, and we start to see how that changes them. And that is where we get that transformation, that payoff. So remember that reader who was not loving the book they were reading, but they were hanging in there to see what happened. This is the moment they are waiting for, the transformation, where your protagonist is making a different choice based on everything they have learned, everything they have experienced in your story. So in this instance, Scrooge wakes up on Christmas morning and he has changed. I'm just remembering, I love the Muppet adaptation of A Christmas Carol. If you haven't seen it, it's so fun. And he gets up and he buys the largest bird and he can't wait to go over to see Tiny Tim and prepare this Christmas feast. He has changed, and his changes are believable because we have seen him on his journey. We have gone through a very harrowing experience with him. And so this change, this transformation feels earned. And this, of course, is the moment your readers have been waiting for. And your transformation, sometimes people will come to me and they really don't like the ending of their story. And they keep rewriting the ending over and over again. And the problem is not getting solved because the problem was not the ending. It was not the transformation. It was, this could be a great idea, but if the journey everything that happened before the transformation is either not believable, it's maybe there's not enough tension in it, maybe there wasn't enough time for the character to understand the crisis. A lot of times people gloss over that crisis moment where the realization, where your character has a epiphany or eureka moment. If those parts of your story get cut short, or not well developed, no matter how good your transformation is, it's not going to land. It's going to feel like a sappy ending. A lot of writers talk about, or readers talk about, oh, I don't like a story with a pretty red bow at the end. I like things to be a little bit left undone. And I'm that kind of reader. But I find that if the pretty red bow is tied up tightly, like if it makes sense because of everything that came before it, I can handle a happy ending. I can handle a really nice, tidy ending because it feels inevitable. It makes sense. So sometimes the scene that is not landing isn't actually your story's problem. It's somewhere earlier on. And this is why understanding story structure is so helpful. So at this stage, you will ask yourself what new understanding is going to allow your protagonist to act differently. And so for Scrooge, it was likely, seeing his funeral not well attended and seeing the plate of Tiny Tim, and that is what inspires the transformation. So we talked about this a little bit already, three common ways that writers work. And so not every writer is going to use the information that I'm talking about today in the same way. You probably recognize yourself somewhere in the spectrum of a plotter. That's my client with the ginormous outline. Pantsers who want to discover through drafting, they want to be surprised. And then many, many of us are plantsers. We use a combination of planning and discovery. And often people come to me calling themselves a plotter or pantser, but by the end of our first conversation, it becomes more clear, probably a pantser, or plantser rather, using what works from both of those different systems. Regardless of where you land on this spectrum, it's all good. None is inherently better. The goal is always to understand how you work so that you can use the information you glean from the exercises we've been talking about, and that you can use them to really shape a narrative in a way that works for you. So here are some tips. If you are a plotter, you may want to take the information we've talked about today and really flesh out a chapter by chapter outline. That can be as detailed or as vague as you like. I work with a lot of writers who like to outline every single chapter. So essentially, they've really written their story, but there's no dialogue. There's nothing that makes a story a story. It's just more a series of scenes with the ideas. Can be very, very effective, and it can make the next step of writing so much easier. You might like to have, like I said, a list of scenes, a timeline. Many writers like to have very in-depth character profiles before they start writing. And a lot of the information that goes in those character profiles isn't necessarily stuff you'll use in your story, but it just gets you going. It gets you thinking about what they are capable of and what they may do in the story. So all this pre-work, if it resonates for you, it's going to become the foundation of your story, and it is going to make momentum really catch. You're gonna get through that writing faster than if you didn't do this. I do find that this is very good for those writers for which efficiency is important. If you're a pantser, you do not want this detailed outline. And so you can use today's answers as guideposts. You can journal about the different questions. You can take a walk and think about the different questions I've asked. And it just gives you a sense of who's going to change in your story, what's going to change, why it matters. And you don't need to feel restricted by this. This is just permission. This is just kind of a ticket to get you started on exploring your story in more detail. You don't need to know every step of the journey before you take the first one. But it can be nice to know, perhaps where you're headed in a vague way. And then if you're a plancer, you'll want to know the beginning and the ending and maybe several major turning points in your story. And again, you can glean all that information by going through the exercises we talked about today and going answering those questions. Um, you can kind of think of the Plancer and style as somebody who drives across the country and they know at the end of the trip they want to be in California, but they don't really care how they get there, and they maybe they have a map and they're going to refer to it from time to time, but in general they're okay with detours. Perfectly fine way to write a story and a really fun way to write a story. So, regardless of how you identify as a plotter, pantser, whoever you are, um, I'm going to recommend that you spend some time as soon as you're able to create a one-page document about your story. And I would also recommend this to you if you are further along in the process, if you are in the revision stage even. Write one paragraph that describes your book and includes the disruption, the journey, the crisis, and the transformation. Just think back to the Christmas Carol example if these terms start to feel confusing. And think about how these ideas are covered in your story. And then ask yourself, what are you still trying to understand about this? Keep this document around, refer to it often. My guess is that it's going to change along the way and you can update it. Think of this as a dynamic document. It certainly doesn't need to be set in stone, though it can be. Again, it's up to you. But this is a really good way when we are trying to balance a bunch of different elements, a bunch of different ideas. This is a really good way to streamline our thoughts, to put them into a form that we can really tackle strategically and creatively. Because the less we're chasing after ideas and trying to understand what the heck it is we're doing, the more wildly creative we can be. Because we don't have those kind of ordinary hurdles in front of us, right? We're free to do much more analytical thinking, much more thoughtful, creative work. So, for final takeaways, before you write chapter one or before you revise it for the seventh time, I want you to really think about the story that is beneath your topic. Make sure that you have a story beneath your topic. Understand who is changing and why. Find your story's major turning points. Choose a planning process that fits your temperament. And I will also say, just back on that plotter pantser thing, the interesting thing I noticed for writers is that we're very quick to decide, okay, this is who I am. This is the kind of artist I am. But I have noticed that with different projects, we become different kinds of creators. So it is perfectly okay and actually really exciting if you notice that when you were writing your memoir, plotting was really important. But when you were writing your novel, that didn't work so well anymore. You didn't know how to do an outline for that because you weren't quite sure where you were going. And sometimes a different system just lends itself better to a different story. So be open to that, of course. And finally, creating a simple roadmap or a very complex roadmap, whatever works most for you. But the key point is no matter what method you're going to use, don't necessarily start by just digging into the writing. Start by understanding what you're building, what you want to build. A strong foundation is just going to give you, it's just an invaluable resource for guiding you forward. So finally, I want to just talk about what we're going to be talking about next month. We will be talking about all things character related, how to develop your character. Now that you kind of found your story, you know what you want to write about, you want to know who the person is that's going to be living inside of the story. What do they want? What do they fear? What do they refuse to see in them, to believe or see about themselves? And how do the tensions that manifest as a result drive your story forward? So we will be talking about that next time. I really hope that you are able to join us. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about. There's so much to learn. There's so much to think about. And it's really great for writers at all stages because we need to think about these issues no matter where we are at in our story. So please join me. And if you have any questions at all at any time, please reach out to me, and I would be so happy to discuss them with you. Thank you.